Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. This is the start in many ways of the academic new year for us. I wish we had a kind of an expression which is happy academic new year, which I would all wish you. This is the first event. I've just been in Australia on holidays for a few weeks, so it's lovely to come back and be involved in this extremely important issue, which is employee ownership and how this can help to transform the economy. My name's Andre Spicer. I'm a professor here, but I'm also Dean of Bayes Business School. I'd like to welcome you here this afternoon for this important issue. At Bayes, we take our role of developing professionals and business people and leaders in organizations very seriously. And we see ourselves developing people who change business for the better and hopefully change our world for the better through doing that. And we also see the role of doing this as not just doing this in large multinationals or banks, consultancy firms, where indeed many of our graduates go, but also in the public sector and also employee-owned organizations. And I'll give you a few words about how we've tried to influence that in a second. But we think it's vital for our economy to have a mixed economy with a wide range of organizations. And we see the organizational form of employee-owned organizations as a really important part of that mixed ecology of business. Our areas here of expertise are in areas like management, which spans many disciplines, including entrepreneurship, strategy, technology, operations, and other things. But what the theme of today is around employee ownership. And we have some experts sitting in the audience here, Ajay Bala and Anish Banerjee, who have both done extensive research and contributed to the policy agenda around this. And I know we also try to bring it into our teaching and to our impact work, which we see as really, really vital. So we're very proud to have a relationship with the EOA, which goes back, I think, over 1 decade, where we've worked very closely with them over time to try and shape this important policy agenda. It's also my pleasure to welcome today Joseph Blasi, Professor and Director Emeritus at the Rutgers University School of Management and Labour Relations, to deliver this Robert Oakeshott Lecture, which we're very proud to host here at Bayes. The lecture commemorates the life and legacy of the founder of the EOA, and the champion of employee ownership, which is Robert Oakeshott. Now, before I hand over to our chair to formally introduce Professor Blasi and this afternoon's event, please could I remind you to ensure that your mobile phones are switched to silent and allow everyone to enjoy the discussion. At the conclusion of this afternoon's talk, I do hope you enjoy us to carry on the conversation over some light drinks. Now, let me hand over to Chris McDermott, the chair of EOA, to introduce this afternoon's lecture. Chris.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I am Chris McDermott, the chair of the EOA, and it's a tremendous pleasure, let's get the right slide, to welcome you to the 2025 Robert Oakeshott Lecture. Thank you for joining us, whether you're a long-standing champion of employee ownership, a curious newcomer, or a future advocate in the making. This is a particularly important occasion in our calendar, an opportunity to come together to celebrate the life and legacy of Robert Oakeshott and to reflect on the future of the movement he helped to found. We're especially grateful to Arup for generously sponsoring today's event and to our hosts here at Bayes for their warm hospitality and enduring support. And we do have members of Robert's family and some friends with us here today. And we just want to say thank you so much for being here. I know his sister Rose is there in the centre there. So thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate you spending the time today. Each year, this lecture asks us to think big, true to the spirit of Robert himself, principled, imaginative, and always seeking better ways of organising enterprise. Robert believed that employee ownership went beyond just being a business model. It was an economic philosophy, guided in fairness, democracy, and dignity at work. He saw a future where the rewards of enterprise would be shared, not concentrated, and where people would have a stake and a say in the businesses they helped build. Today, we carry forward that vision, not as a theory, but as fast-growing reality. The UK employee ownership sector is growing at pace, There are now over 2,500 employee-owned businesses, up from around 630 just 5 years ago. More than 300,000 employee owners now contribute to businesses that are more resilient, productive, and purpose-driven. And the sector adds around £25 billion to the UK economy and includes some of the most progressive and successful businesses in the country. This is a remarkable transformation, but it hasn't happened by accident. It's the result of sustained effort from champions right across the country, including here in this room today, and of the work of the EOA, which has supported, convened, and championed this community for more than 45 years. Today, the EOA is the engine room of our network, an 800-strong membership community, a trusted voice in policy and public debate, and a platform for learning, leadership, and change. Through programs like EO Learn and our growing advocacy work, we're helping businesses transition, grow, and lead with purpose, powered by people. And that makes the theme of today's lecture especially timely. Is it possible to organise an economy with employee ownership at its heart? It's a big question and a necessary one, because while the sector is growing, it's still relatively small compared to the scale of what's possible. We need to move from proving the case to scaling the model, from the margins to the mainstreams. And to do that, we need big ideas, lots of evidence, and ambition. That's why we're so pleased to be joined today by Professor Joseph Blasi, a world authority on employee ownership and a tireless advocate for shared capitalism. But before we hear from the professor, I mentioned earlier that today's event is kindly being sponsored by Arup. And I would like to hand over to my fellow EOA board director and global corporate affairs and partnerships leader at Arup, Erin Gill, to say a few words. Erin.
Hello. I don't think I have a mic at the moment. There was a mic that on the pad. Thank you so much. Thank you. Is that working? Yeah. So I'm Erin Gill, and I am one of about 19,000 people worldwide who count themselves as Arup members. So we're not really employees, we're members, and we share in the success and the challenges that Arup faces. For those of you who don't know who we are, we're an engineering-led professional services firm, and we turn 80 years old next year. For almost 50 of those years, we've been employee-owned. So we became employee-owned in the late 1970s. We're very pleased to sponsor this lecture, not least because it is in honor of Robert Oakeshott, who founded the EOA, and we were one of the founding members. So we're very pleased to continue that, that participation in growing the sector. As Chris said, the employee ownership sector in the UK is growing. It's growing quickly. That's really heartening. But we are nowhere near the size that we could be. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Professor Joseph Blasi has to say. I want to get some new ideas about how we can get to that mainstream position where EO is at the heart of this economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Erin. And I also want to thank all of you, our members, allies, and friends for being part of this community. Whether you're here as a founder, a practitioner, a policymaker, or simply someone who believes business can be better, your work and commitment really do matter. Robert Oakeshott believed that enterprise could serve everyone, not just the few. That belief is more relevant than ever. And today we have the privilege of continuing that conversation and carrying it forward, because now it's time for the main event. Joseph Blasi, there we go, is the J. Robert Baster Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University and former director of its Institute for Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. He's the author of several influential books, including The Citizen's Share, and a trusted advisor to policymakers in the US and internationally. Few people have done more to show how employee ownership can serve as the foundation of a more just and resilient economy. And we're really honoured to have him with us here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Blasi.
I'm not good with technology. Well, I'm very honored to be here today, and especially thankful to the Oakeshott family. Robert's life and work inspired me as a young scholar from afar. Thank you to the Bayes Business School, the Employee Ownership Association, and ARIP for their kind invitation. I'm very aware, as the person sitting at the party, who not sure whether she belongs, of being here in the UK. And so I will be speaking to you, I hope with a sense of restrained humility, to try to suggest some ideas for your consideration. As a guest in your country, I want to avoid obsequious praise or uninformed criticism. I will be engaging in a lot of very straight talk, hopefully based on evidence. And I will be benchmarking the US and the UK to each other, not the UK to the US and not the US to the UK. I will be trying to use data to do this. You will see that oftentimes there isn't enough data to actually make a real comparison. Okay, wonderful. For the dean, I will say that I'm using public domain art, so you won't be sued. Trying to focus on British museums and some US museums. So let's start out with some of the inspirational ideas to talk about employee ownership at the heart of the economy.
Sorry, can you talk a bit louder?
Sure, I can talk about a bit louder, absolutely. And is it possible that this is not working?
Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Is that better? Sure. Yeah. Okay, good. So the ideal I think we're interested in is human dignity. To use John Rawls' idea of a property owning democracy really makes most sense. The economic liberty of the farmer proprietor inspires us. And as we discovered by those who tried to design employee ownership and profit sharing in the US early in its history, there wasn't enough land to go around. So Galusha Grow, who you've never heard about, he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives under President Abraham Lincoln in the United States. And he put the Homestead Act to spread land to all our citizens, many of our citizens, through the Congress for President Lincoln. He did that, but then he said, you know what? There isn't enough land for all the citizens to have the economic liberty of the farmer proprietors. And therefore, he said, corporations have a lot of shares, and corporations can be the new land. So why is employee ownership a big idea? First challenge is flat wages. The fixed wage system has collapsed. These are UK figures: annual growth in average earnings, 5.5%, inflation, 4.1%, average real wage growth, 1.7%. If the fixed wage system has collapsed, wages are not going to take us in terms of improving the wealth of the working middle class. Wages are not going to solve the issue of extreme economic inequality. Second, again, this skewed wealth. Here in the UK, the top 1% owning 10% of all wealth, the top 10% owning 43%, the middle 40% owning 52%, the bottom 50% owning only 9%, and the top 50 families owning more than the bottom 50% of the population. I love that art picture to illustrate this idea. The third challenge, threatened pensions. State pensions, as you know, are under budget. With inflationary pressure, there's an insolvency threat. Life expectancy is rising faster than pension age. Only 7% of your population have defined benefit pension plans, similar to ours. 51% contribute to a DC, defined contribution plan, but 54% of them are under saving and 45% are saving nothing. These figures are very similar in both countries. The fourth challenge, few realistic policy options. Okay. If you wanted to significantly change the wealth accumulation of the working middle class, could you do extreme corporate tax increases? Not going to happen. Could you significantly cut the personal income tax of members of the population? Not likely. Could you radically expand the social safety net to, in a really significant way, affect the amount of money and assets that people have? Could you have economic growth of a tremendously new nature spurred from the right, or social democracy spurred from the left? Maybe a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But the issue is that we don't see typical policy solutions that have the advantages of broad-based employee share ownership. We would like to have all of the good aspects of this list of policy solutions that I've mentioned, but we don't see realistically any one of them solving the issue of increasing the funds available to the working middle class and significantly changing their wealth. So my job today, talking about employee ownership possibly being at the heart of the economy, I'll take a clinical approach using data. As I said, there'll be some comparison of both countries. You'll be surprised to know that it is my view that both countries can benefit from similar recommendations. Okay. But the other thing I want to say in starting is that the UK has some enormous advantages, and I want to credit those. And certainly Robert Oakeshott's contribution is really important to note at this point, both philosophically, politically, historically, and practically. You inspired the US employee ownership sector in the mid-1800s. The developments in profit sharing in the UK inspired the big industrialists like the Pillsbury family, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and others in the late 1800s who became interested in profit sharing. The scholarship in the UK happened far before we ever did scholarship in the United States. Your worker cooperative movement inspired the worker cooperative movement in the United States and proved to be sort of the nursery of a lot of these ideas. Employee ownership trusts in the UK were created here and have inspired us in the United States. The growth of employee ownership trusts in the UK is far ahead of the growth of ESOPs, which is a not dissimilar form of majority employee-owned business in the United States. You are growing at a faster rate than we are here. So there's a lot of positive things to say, and I want to be sure that we don't lose those as I get into some other issues. Now, I have made available to you a sheet of numbers. I'm not going to spend my talk reading numbers, but these are so you don't have to focus on the numbers. You can take these home and think about some of the comparisons. But you'll see a lot of NAs on this sheet. not available, which means that we're really not in a perfect position to compare both countries. So the NA is an invitation to scholars in both countries to fill in those blanks, because our economies and peoples are most similar than I think any two countries doing employee ownership in the world, and we can benefit from a joint dialogue. So first, we're going to talk about closely held firms, not traded on a listed stock market, and publicly traded firms. So in terms of closely held firms, the UK has about 3,000, as we've heard, employee-owned businesses, including 365 worker cooperatives, about, we've heard, 300,000 total employees. The US has about 7,000 employee-owned businesses, mostly ESOPs, including about 1,000 worker cooperatives. Let me just say, I'll be talking about referring to ESOPs in the United States. ESOPs are simply a form of an employee-owned firm, which is typically set up with the company borrowing money, buying stock, which it grants to workers. The workers do not pay for the stock, and the company pays the loan back with federal tax incentives. Our core employee-owned approach in the United States is not based on the workers buying the stock, okay? And this is very similar to the EOTs in the UK, where the workers themselves, again, are not buying the stock. There's basically a leveraged buyout taking place, financed by the retired business owner or banking sources. So one of the interesting observations I've made is using data which has been available from researchers in both countries. In the US, in the UK, EOTs and worker cooperatives represent less than 1.7% of all size categories of all firms. And in the US, ESOPs and worker cooperatives represent less than 2.5% of all size categories of all firms. And there's the breakdown. And what you take away from this chart is the US is slightly ahead of the UK in terms of representing more larger firms, the 1,000 or more employee category, the 250 to 999 employee category. But really, I think the main takeaway here is that we're really, both countries, impacting size categories of firms in a very minor way. Now, the next thing on closely held companies is to compare the US and UK in terms of growth and wealth. You know, as I said, the UK, in my opinion today, has a larger employee-owned sector proportionally, given the differences in population and size of economy than the US by firms and workers, growing at about 10 firms per week versus the US, where ESOPs are growing at about 6 firms per week. And at the current rate of growth, the UK, at least in terms of EOTs, is set to surpass the US. Now, this may be significantly changed by some new really exciting policy initiatives we have in the US Senate and the US House of Representatives, but I think this is a fact. 12% versus 2% of US buyouts are firms more than 1,000 employees. So this is a case where the UK needs to figure out how to deal with larger firms. US ESOPs have an average of 122,000 British pounds in wealth and 270,000 after 10 years of service. But let's be clear, these are averages of all of the employee ownership value of all ESOPs in the United States. If you really want to talk about apples and apples and compare the wealth accumulation and employee ownership value between the two countries, it's very, very hard to do so. So if you look at my chart, you'll see that I have average ownership share per worker, and I break it down according to different age groups. I'm not going to read them off, but in terms of workers, for example, 45 to 54 years old, the average employee ownership value is 19,160 British pounds. So we don't have figures on the average employee ownership value in the UK to compare to the US. We don't have figures by age in the UK to compare to the US. Well, I am told that the average employee ownership trust dividend is £2,780 per year. that's a dividend. And we have no way to compare that to equity value because in the US, the workers don't receive a dividend each year. They actually have individual share accounts and equity value. So the comparisons are difficult to make. We have to make these comparisons in terms of gender, in terms of age, and in terms of minority and majority groups in the population. And we're far from being able to do this in both countries. I think the big question in comparing the US and the UK today, especially since the US mostly has ESOPs where workers have individual equity accounts, and the UK is now mostly having employee ownership trusts, is whether the average employee ownership trust dividend per year over an average worker's life, how that will compare to the US model where the worker has an individual account, gets equity value plus capital gains plus profit sharing. What will be the wealth accumulation of both models? I don't think we have the ability to answer that question. Certainly what we would hope if we want employee ownership to go to the heart of the economy is that both models can result in significant wealth accumulation for workers. So these are some of the more specific figures in terms of comparing, as the artist shows us, what is really apples and pears. So can't make a good comparison. It would be good if we could compare the two countries with some better research. The big average wealth accumulation of US ESOPs looks very big, but then when you look at it in terms of age groups, it starts to come down close to the level of the EOT annual dividend. We're not in a position to make really solid comparisons right now. Okay. Now, one interesting item here is that there is a stunning research consensus between the UK and the US. I like to think of that fight in the picture as the fight between the evidence that the current economy can do well and can produce growth and wealth for workers, and the fight that an employee-owned economy can do well and produce wealth for workers. Well, the UK Employee Ownership Association Ownership at Work Knowledge Program by WPI did compare 152 employee-owned businesses to 285 non-EOBs. And Rutgers just did a new study comparing tens of thousands of non-ESOP manufacturing companies to about 12,000 ESOP manufacturing companies. And it's notable to say that both studies have reached pretty much the same conclusions about employee-owned businesses having more productivity, having lower turnover, and more employment stability. In fact, when I first saw the Employee Ownership Association's research, I said, these are really fantastic findings. And then when I saw our findings, I said, look, when these two major organizations agree on research, something is really, really going on here. Now, the findings agree on many of these issues that I've talked about. Okay. So in terms of the closely held sector, what are the major barriers to making it come to the heart of the economy? Well, I'm going to talk about some of the less likely reasons. The number of business owners near retirement is not a reason, right? In both countries, we have a stunning number of business owners near retirement. Children ready to take over the firm, that's not a reason. I don't know what the numbers are in the United States, but we're down to the point of only 10% of daughters and sons want to take over the parents' home. Employee ownership is becoming an absolute necessity. They want to be doctors and lawyers and artists and do other things. They don't want to take over the firm. Management buyouts. Actually, in the UK, there are fewer management buyouts now than EOT, so that's not an issue. The number of offers the owner receives is not really a barrier. In the US, our owners, many of them are not receiving any offers. They're having to close down the companies. And the availability of a private equity offer. In the US, Private equity is picking off the strongest firms and leaving everybody else, to deal with their own situation. The more likely reasons preventing closely held employee ownership from being at the heart of the economy: lack of information or interest. Our Small Business Administration has had a very, very hard time educating the American public, and it has offices in all 50 states about employee ownership. We have a situation where our House and Senate small business committees are in constant conflict with our Small Business Administration, which can't get its bureaucracy to educate the public about this. It's just a fact. I've looked at some of the comparable government agencies in the UK. You're doing a much better job on this. The owner does not want to self-finance the employee ownership buyout in the UK. There are many owners who would love to do an employee ownership buyout, who need to sell their company so they could buy their condo in Boca Raton and distribute their wealth to their children. But banks are not willing to fund with the credit 100% of these buyouts. In manufacturing firms, banks may fund 40 to 60% of the buyout with credit. In service firms where there is not enough collateral to back up a senior lender, a bank loan, you'd be lucky if you get 10 to 20% of credit for such a thing. The owner does not want to self-fund this, take back a note, and wait 5 to 7 years to get paid back by the employees. This is a principal barrier in the United States. I suggest that it is also a barrier here. I know most of your EOTs are self-financed by retired business owners. You're not going to be able to grow the sector unless you can get bank lenders willing to get involved and other creditors willing to get involved in financing these buyouts. And I have some suggestions how to do that. Larger buyouts, separate from this issue, require an outside lender and significant credit from banks. And I also mentioned there are simply, in many of the transactions in the US, I've been advisor to the US Treasury Department on employee ownership during the recent administration for 3.5 years. And I did a study on this. There's simply insufficient hard assets to get the collateral to get 100% bank support. So this is a capital markets issue. It's not only an ideological issue. And I say a capital markets issue means it's not only a government policy issue, it's a capital markets issue. Now, how to increase closely held buyouts? And at this point, as I said, I consider both countries to be fairly similar in their problems with some slight differences. More banks need to be involved in bigger deals. And this means that there needs to be more discussion in banking associations with senior lenders. How could that possibly happen? We did an experiment during President Ronald Reagan's administration where President Reagan's staff and Senator Russell Long, who's a Democrat, now deceased, Democrat from Louisiana, powerful chair of our Senate Finance Committee. They got together and their staffs came up with an idea that any bank or lending institution, say such as an insurance company, any holder of capital credit, would be able to deduct from its income taxes, before it paid its corporate income taxes, half of its interest income on loans to set up an ESOP, okay? And I will tell you, I was a young legislative assistant in the House of Representatives. I watched as every major investment bank in the United States set up an ESOP division. It was stunning. It wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about them, reading the books. It was about them visiting companies. We did the incentive and we transformed the entire investment banking hierarchy in New York City literally overnight. And we got stunning things. We got the $1 billion bond that one of the major investment banks did to fund the $1 billion Procter and Gamble ESOP. It wasn't ideology at all, okay? And we got many of these deals. This tax incentive, and it was a tax incentive that didn't cost very much, right? Half of your interest income to deduct before you pay your corporate income tax. The tax incentive was cut under the Bush administration, I think mistakenly, actually, and all of that went away just like that. Okay. What we have to do also is address the collateral problem. There is now a major legislation in the U.S. been proposed by the ESOP Association to address the collateral problem, right? The problem that a business owner wants to sell to her or his employees does not want to self-finance the credit to do the sale, and therefore chooses another option, which may include shutting the company down. So we have now in the United States this American Ownership Resiliency Act. I put the credits at the end of my talk. It's endorsed by the U.S. ESOP Association. It has both left and right significant endorsement in both the U.S. Senate and the House. I gave you the link so that you could read the act. What does this act do? It's really interesting. What it does is it empowers the U.S. Department of Commerce to set up special investment firms around the United States to license them. But these investment firms only do one kind of deal. They do majority or 100% employee ownership buyouts. And how do they get around the issue of giving the extra credit to the retiring business owner? They bring private capital together, put that in this bucket. And then the government provides government loan guarantees. And it's the combination of the private capital and the government loan guarantees, which will allow these investment firms to do 100% employee buyouts, financed 100% by outside credit. I think this legislation has a really good chance of passing. I will say I cannot see another idea that will significantly change the rate of closely held majority employee buyouts other than this idea. There is another idea, and that's, as you see, HR House of Representatives 3248 and Senate 1645. We have another piece of legislation which is being proposed by Pete Stavros, who is leading executive at private equity firm KKR. And his idea hasn't been fleshed out yet. It's called the Expanding ESOPs Initiative, expandingesops.com. And his idea is to create a new ESOP format, which will have certain financial advantages so that every chief financial officer and every chief executive officer will say, I have to tell my staff to explore doing an ESOP. And we'll be seeing some details about that other initiative. Buyouts of closely held firms will be slow as long as families are asked to act like banks. And the more both economies evolve in terms of employee ownership, even if we see a lot more growth, we're not going to really go to the heart of the economy unless we solve this problem. Now let's switch the conversation to listed companies. And this is a much harder conversation. Aaron and I were emailing each other back, and I mentioned to Aaron in an email that we're never going to see employee share ownership go to the heart of the economy unless the listed companies do it in a significant. It's just not going to happen. And any kind of sophomorish notion that we shouldn't be interested in the stock market, we shouldn't be interested in big fund, all of that has to go out the door. And I want to just give you one factoid, which I've talked a lot about in speeches and in hearings in the US. You can take your small 500 person, 100% owned ESOP, and the average wealth accumulation and employee ownership per worker will be $200,000. And then after 20 years, you can get close to $400,000 in value, okay? And then you can take ExxonMobil with a 2% ESOP, right? And the average employee ownership per worker will be $200,000, and maybe you'll get to $400,000. What I'm trying to say is a small amount of total shares outstanding in an ESOP of one of the giant companies will provide you the same amount of wealth per worker of a 100% 500-person manufacturing ESOP. We have to digest this. We can't have some sense of ideological purity or some sense of allergy to the stock market. If this is a capital markets problem, the stock market is central to capital markets. Now, just to give a little bit of a comparison about what we know about listed companies in the US and the UK. In the UK, and these are, I worked over the last few weeks, and Graham has been extremely helpful to me as the great knowledge holder here in the UK on employee ownership. And so thank you, Graham. There are about 1,000 share incentive plans and save as you earn plans covering about 900,000 employees and with about 10.3 billion British pounds between 2020 and 2024, or 11,500 pounds per worker, representing about 0.5% of the FTSE 680. The total shares outstanding less than 5%. These are recent numbers, based on recent numbers from your Office of Statistics. Again, what we are unable to do, we do not have a number of the total employee ownership in the UK listed firms. We just don't have the number. We have recent reports over what's happened with these plans in the last few years. We do not know the average employee ownership per worker who has employee ownership in UK firms. We don't know the average total shares outstanding in UK firms that have employee ownership. We need to sort of see these numbers. Now we go to the US and we have 304 firms with 8 million workers in ESOPs. But that's kind of a mirage, because really most of those firms have small ESOPs integrated with 401k plans, defined contribution plans, and the average wealth per worker, as you see there, is only about 14,000 British pounds. We have 99 pure ESOP firms with significant ESOPs, about 2% of the company, and there the workers have 93,000, average 93 British pounds in wealth. But let me just be clear, that large segment of publicly owned firms in the United States, that came from that legislation, giving that 0.5% deduction from those banks under President Reagan and Senator Long, and this sector has never grown. That's ESOPs. In terms of equity compensation in the US, we have 14 million employees in thousands of firms with an average of 67,000 British pounds and a median of 11,000 British pounds. So just to sort of get to the cut to the chase, to try to compare both countries, I would say this. The US had this great idea that President Reagan, Senator Long introduced to move employee ownership in listed firms. The Bush administration eliminated it. And so now in terms of policy on listed firms, the UK is ahead of the game, okay? Your policy is better than our policy for listed firms. However, in terms of being able to compare the average employee ownership and to know the percent of employee ownership in listed companies, the US is better on data than the UK, and we are unable to compare both countries. So this is difficult, but it's clear that we need to do something with the public sector. I will tell you that I've recently been digging into the non-ESOP equity compensation plans at Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple. Their plans involve all employees. Amazon recently excluded warehouse workers from its plan, but it is still a broad-based plan. The Microsoft plus Amazon plus Apple employee equity ownership plans likely have more employee ownership wealth than the entire closely held ESOP sector in the United States. That one factoid, just register that. That tells you how important it is to look at the publicly traded sector. So this repeats what I've said. There are no measurements of total UK employee equity ownership or total employees, but you have better policy than we do. But we have more employees with more wealth. Part of that is because we have the super techs. The super techs out of Silicon Valley have done broad-based employee ownership. It results in a lot of money. Many of them are still committed to this idea. And we have a larger venture startup area with broad-based employee ownership. I tried to collect some figures. I don't really have the figures, but we have about 40,000 venture startups which are being monitored by the firm Carta.com, which is the leader in monitoring venture startups. A lot of employee ownership in those firms. We need to see a monitoring of the venture startups and their employee ownership in the UK. Okay, so how to expand UK listed company employee ownership and equity ownership. First of all, we need bank credit to purchase larger stakes on the ESOP model, where a company like ExxonMobil can set up an ESOP, borrow $1 billion, and get tax incentives when it pays back the loan to the bank or insurance company or bondholders. For a AAA categorized company, for a blue chip company, these are easy deals to do with tax incentives. We did hundreds of these deals with the President Ronald Reagan and Senator Russell Long, little tax incentive back in the late 80s and early 90s. There's no reason why any significant economy like the US and UK couldn't continue to do this. We need the major financial services firms to do large bond issues like the $1 billion Procter & Gamble bond issue to fund an ESOP. You would need just very, very modest tax incentives to get all the major banks to set up a facility to do this. As I said, we need to provide lenders with an interest income deduction to encourage them to do this. Another idea being strongly considered in the United States, again with a third piece of legislation in the US Senate and the House, is to provide a lower corporate tax rate to listed companies that have a broad-based employee ownership plan. I think this is well worth considering. I've put the citation for the legislation, which has been developed by a private equity executive, Robert Patricelli, in the United States. It also has joint Republican and Democratic support. We need to publicly recognize that the leading tech companies do generous plans, and we need the leading tech companies to talk about their plans. I'm delighted to say that one of the things our institute has done is we have people from pure worker cooperatives, people from the public tech companies, people from the listed companies, and people from the 500-person, 100% ESOPs, all in the same conferences, talking to each other. And there's a lot more similar issues than you might think. We need to focus away from employees purchasing stock to grants. Okay, now you don't have the problem here in the UK, but we've had a problem in the US. It's called the Enron problem. Sometimes you have a pension plan and the company pushes employees to buy the stock. Broad-based employee ownership in the publicly traded sector and the closely held sector should not be primarily based on the employees buying the stock with their savings or wages, period, the end. And on some days you wake me up and I would actually like to make that illegal, okay? So just period, the end. We're talking about building new assets and new wealth. The people who are rich in both countries don't put their hand in their pocket to buy their casinos and to buy their condo investments. They go and they get credit, and they make more money than the cost of the credit. They pay back the credit, and they end up with 100% ownership of the asset. That was Louis Kelso's idea, which inspired the ESOP, and the working and middle working classes should be benefiting from the same kind of leveraged use of credit. Now, one of the issues that I came across as I was looking at this for the UK is that I was just looking at the FTSE 10, and I was stunned to see that only 13% on average of the workers of the FTSE 10 were actually UK residents. So we actually have to be super careful about talking about spreading this to listed companies when it looks like it doesn't trickle down to UK residents. So that's a particular issue. I'm not sure we have a problem as bad as this in the US. It really stunned me. You know, as a researcher, I've been doing empirical research for 50 years. I can tell you this is one of those moments where I was stunned by a statistic that I think was really quite shocking. Now, I actually think this guy looks a lot like Graham Nuttall, and maybe because of your role here in the UK, Graham, that it was actually you that they were doing this statue on. We need a different attitude. We need to appreciate more democratic and intensive forms of employee ownership. All right, we don't have a fast level of growth with worker cooperatives, but worker cooperatives have been the sort of nursery where these ideas are born and thought about and have been proven. And so that's very, 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 very important. And I am convinced that if we had more discussion about employees sharing in the rewards in grammar schools and high schools and college programs, that this would affect the rate of the growth of worker cooperatives in both countries. I think it's a case, partly a case of socialization. I remember I was invited to speak a lecture on executive compensation to our son's second grade class. And when I did this, I asked the children to design the method by which the executives and employees in the company would share in the rewards. And they designed a broad-based plan. Okay, that's what they did. Okay. We do have to be open and tolerant of a wider variety of approaches. Our institute at Rutgers has, as I said, people from pure worker cooperatives to people running the executive plans at Microsoft and Apple in the same conferences, talking to each other. And we have to try to avoid this sort of intersectional fight between formats. Purist ideology is a recipe for a tiny sector and wasteful divisiveness. We need to embrace capital markets, especially the stock exchanges, bonds, and investment banks. They will run a lot of this. I will tell you that the legitimacy that both the closely held sector doing employee ownership creates and that the publicly traded listed sector creates help and reinforce each other when you're dealing in Congress. I've been an advisor several presidential administrations. I was a legislative assistant at the age of 27 in 1977, so 50 years of policy experience. We need to see these groups helping and supporting each other in the Congresses and parliaments. We need a societal shift. Now, what would this supportive environment look like? That's the film, We the Owners, that you can get and see on the website of our institute, made by Marianne Beister, a film producer. We need education and awareness for citizens beginning at schools. If broad-based workers sharing in profits and equity is not seen as an average kind of thing, then it will never become an average kind of thing. And that means curricula in schools. We need education and awareness at business owners. I did a study some years ago of all of the major universities in the United States that do case studies, because case teaching, as the dean knows, is used in a significant way in business schools. And I can tell you, many of these business schools, they did case studies of companies that had significant employee ownership and profit sharing plans and never mentioned the employee ownership or profit sharing plan. That the percent of case studies of companies addressing employee share ownership and profit sharing was far below the representation of those companies in the population. There's actually a prejudice. Now, I actually think, and I'm not counting for this dean because this dean already has spoken, is very friendly, that many deans think that broad-based equity ownership by employees somehow, irritates their donors, or sends the wrong message, or whatever. I know of 2 deans in the United States who received offers of significant program support who turned it down, I think, for that reason. So we need a lot of leadership on behalf of deans. Our institute has set up the University Consortium on employee ownership to have the universities around the world who are cooperating on this, to work on this. We're working with Kellogg College at Oxford on this. We're working with a program at the University of Pennsylvania on this. We're working with the new program at the Harvard Business School on this. We've developed, with help from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, programs to teach lawyers, accountants, business brokers, consultants, and bankers about these ideas. I think that's very important. And we need to do a lot more on conferences and videos. It's necessary to have a quick multiplication of regional employee ownership centers in the regions, counties, cities, colleges, and universities. We've developed about 23 state employee ownership centers. We have a group called the Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which is developing these centers with small full-time staff. The ESOP Association has developed chapters in most of the states of the United States. We've got to get down to the county and state and state level. Now, just briefly about research. This is my fullest slide, so I'm not going to just read off on it. But what I'll tell you is what we need to do in terms of research. As I said, the UK needs some national measures of employee share ownership and profit sharing using national statistics. You just don't have it. You can't measure it either in the closely held sector or the publicly traded sector. I think the UK would benefit from a simple one-page report to the government for all closely held firms and listed companies on who's in the plan and the size of the plan. ESOPs in the United States must give such a report every year to the US Department of Labor. And as I said at Oxford last week, the reason why we could do a lot of great research in our institute is because we simply push one button and we have all that data on our computers. Your scholars need to be able to do the same. Okay, you can't manage it if you can't measure it. Now, especially in the UK, it's important for you to know the average and median size of the dividends in the EOT sector and the value of wealth in the employee ownership non-EOT sector. Okay. A key issue, and this is going to be a bit pointy-headed and wonky, but a key issue for both countries, and a lot of economists who want to be the most skeptical about this idea will say that you need to understand this. Employee share ownership and profit sharing cannot replace a reduction in wages or benefits. So you need to be able to measure wage substitution, right? You need to be able to measure whether employee ownership is only a result of people in these firms being paid lower wages and then getting the employee ownership plans to somehow make up. If that's the case, then it really may be a wash or it may be hypocrisy, okay? Now, in the US, and again, it's really because of some coincidences, not because we were smart or thoughtful. people who design, government bureaucrats who designed our core economic statistics surveys, put questions on those surveys to measure employee ownership, to measure average assets, and to give us the ability to measure wage substitution. So we're able to track this in the United States. Right now, we know that our employee-owned sector is not mostly doing wage and benefit substitution. We know this, right? I was called to the Senate 2 weeks ago, to the Senate Labor Committee, with 6 Republicans, conservatives, and 6 Democratic progressives, and drilled on all these issues. We have the data. We know this. You do not have the data to address the issue of wage and benefit substitution. You need that data. Here are some of your major government surveys. As far as I can tell, no employee ownership and profit sharing questions on these surveys. We need the government officials to do that, as the UK sector, as I said, now proportionally, I believe is and will be larger than the US sector. Maybe not forever until we get this legislation, which is being worked on in the United States, then let both sectors grow and thrive together. Addressing the barriers from the point of view of universities. Except for this business school at Oxford and Leeds and a few others, UK universities are a desert for employee equity ownership, just like many US universities. No mention, no courses, no faculty, no centers, very minor work, maybe just one article. If what I said at the beginning of the lecture is true, where there really aren't many other or any other policy initiatives to address these issues, why are universities asleep at the wheel? You have to ask yourself why. Part of it, I think, has to do with an attachment to the fixed wage system by policy scholars and economists. Some are thinking that we're going to increase fixed wages to address the issue of wage inequality and wealth inequality. The fixed wage system has collapsed. We're getting wage increases equal to the rate of inflation, in both countries. We need to look at how significant a policy idea broad-based employee share ownership is, not just only for the fairness and justice issues that Robert Oakeshott elevated, but now in this moment, significantly more competitive power than other policy ideas. And as I said, I believe the college presidents, deans, and faculty are misjudging this issue. They're sort of stuck in studying the things that they always studied. Who will fund these activities? Here, allow me to be a bit sharper. Okay. In the US, the investment bankers and lawyers who are doing these transactions are contributing generously to fund local regional centers and university centers, including our institute. Alumni who are CEOs of employee-owned firms are funding university programs, okay, with millions and millions of dollars, including ours. Companies, I know they're doing it here very generously, thank you, Arup, are funding, and thank you to your firm, are funding the associations. There's a big role for employee-owned business executives. We have that significantly in the United States. But in both countries, the selling business owners who are getting huge checks written to them are not giving enough. They need to step forward and share the fruits of the checks they're getting from these leverage buyouts, because we're not going to be able to see the university institutions, the company associations, the state centers, or any of these things develop, or policy centers develop in a way without their support. If you just look at the money, that's the main amount of financial advantage is going to the retiring business owners. And I can tell you, I don't know the situation in the UK, but they are sitting on the sidelines in the United States in their condos in Boca, and they need to do more, okay? And then in the US, the top 50 families, richest families and foundations are actually doing a lot. Many of our top 50 foundations, Kellogg Foundation, Ford, Rockefeller, Prudential, are deeply engaged in this issue. I doubt that is the situation in the UK. And so that significantly needs to change. Yes, there is a very important role for government. And Graham showed that with the Nuttall report. And you've made a lot of accomplishment. But key parts of the private sector that are well-resourced, if they don't step up to improve capitalism in the vision that Robert Oakeshott had for it, then they won't have a capitalism left to improve, okay? And they better just sit down and think about this. What will it be? I don't know what it will be. It could be feudalism with the Constitution. That's probably the worst that it could end up with. But we have a true opportunity now to have a fairer, more just economy. But it's not only an issue of government policy. Finally, we know that many citizens have zero access to equity ownership at work, either because they're state employees, they're in the welfare support system, they're taking care of disabled children, whatever it is. And so we need to figure out how are they going to get access to private capital ownership. Submit for your reflection. We have this interesting program out there in the state of Alaska. Alaska's been in the news recently, called the Alaska Permanent Fund. This is where income from and profits from the oil and mineral deposits that private companies are using in Alaska go into a state fund, and they hire Wall Street to manage those funds to produce capital gains and dividends, which are shared with the citizens of Alaska. We need to think about developing these programs in both countries and in different regions of both countries. And frankly, and I would hope that if Robert Oakeshott were with us today, he would call for it, certainly from reading his biography and reading a lot about him, that the large artificial intelligence technology and infrastructure should be owned by these funds and not just the benefit of a few people who just grab the regulatory authority to use them at their own profit. Okay. Thank you very much. And now I'll take some questions, and Graham Nuttall has agreed to be the.
Would you care to come to the
Sure.
the comfortable seats?
Sure.
Thank you, Joseph. That was incredible, amazing. You contributed some original analysis, for which thank you very much, and clearly some original ideas. And can you hear me at the back? Yes, yes. In terms of questions, we have roving mics. You've covered an enormous range there. There are at least a couple of academics in the audience. I wondered if there are any questions from any academics in the audience. Anybody wants to pick up on perhaps anything Joseph has said, particularly about gaps in the research, directions it might go in order to achieve greater take-up? Please, if you'd introduce yourself and your institution.
Yeah, so Ajay Bala, Bayes Business School. One thing which I would be interested is in terms of the teaching you refer to, because research, I've been involved in research along with Anish since 2008. But teaching is something which is very difficult in terms of the student acceptance. So I would be curious as to what kind of direction have you taken at Rutgers, or what you're encouraging at other schools in terms of raising awareness of not just ESOPs, but more on terms of what you talked about, broader shareholding?
So we've developed a course called Equity, Compensation, and Employee Ownership, and it's entirely case-based. So every week we have a different CEO visiting by Zoom, okay, talking about his or her company. And we're talking about ESOPs, Microsoft level equity compensation programs, worker cooperatives, EOTs. And the students love it because it's not just based on dry material. You have the actual company executives there. And this also legitimates for business school and management students that this is a real thing in the business and management economy. This is not some fringy side issue. It's become extremely popular. And I think that's the approach to use. And as a result, Rutgers has developed this thing called the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership, where we make these materials, films and case studies available to colleges worldwide.
Thank you. We also heard about private companies. This is where we know employee ownership, particularly in small and medium-sized enterprises. And you are explaining that we're missing some conversions to employee ownership in this context, because essentially not every owner of a company is prepared to wait 6.7 years to be paid. Are there any professional advisors in the room with experience of trying to convince founders to convert to employee ownership? You wanted to comment on that? There's a hand raised there.
Hi, Stephen Hadlow from Brabner's. Interested about the bank's role. Banks like funding management buyouts because they have management teams with skin in the game, and they're quite often backing the management as much as they're backing the company. That is a challenge that we see with lenders looking to lend in the SME sector. They don't like the fact that there is, in their view, not my word, wishy-washy management, because it's an employee-owned structure, unlike an MBO. I'm just interested to know whether that's something you've experienced in the US.
Sure. In the United States, the larger ESOP buyouts have a management buyout part of it that's separate. So that would be there. Okay. We're not writing about it or talking about it, but it's true. There's a separate management equity plan on top of the ESOP in the United States. And the banks funding them, yes, it's the same thing. Capital markets are very similar in both countries. They're looking to that core management team, not a different. So I think really what's necessary is, as I talked about that tax incentive, something to get the large investment banks and the large banks to start paying attention to these ideas in this sector. The National Center for Employee Ownership in the United States did a study they got from JP Morgan Chase and several of the other big banks, an analysis of the credit ratings and rate of bankruptcy of firms that were participating in ESOP buyouts compared to non-ESOP buyouts. And the ESOP buyouts were many times healthier transactions. So I don't think the empirics or the structure of the transactions are the problem. I think it's an awareness problem and kind of a flip the switch and get it going problem.
Your reference to Reagan's successful initiative provides a nice link to Robert Oakeshott. As a young lawyer, I took a call from Robert to say, the Americans are doing something, tax-free interest on bank loans to finance buyouts. Can you please draft a backbench amendment? I've got a friendly MP who'll table it. So we did try to get the same change made here in the UK, but it didn't pass the Finance Bill Committee.
Well, you can come back to it.
We can come back to it.
Thanks. It's George Barker from Smith & Williamson. Back to your question, Graham, in terms of selling shareholders and waiting 6.7 years. I think it is a challenge, the deferred consideration. And I think with increasing interest rates and people and the selling shareholders, and it's their prerogative, obviously, to charge commercial interest rate. But it's really, they're really surprised when they start to do the math, and when you look at, say, 6 to 8% compound interest rate, 6.7 years could become 10 years, depending on how the interest is paid. But also with regards to some selling shareholders, what we're seeing is that some of them don't want to sell in for the full market value. I mean, obviously it can't be more than the market value, but they're willing to sell in for a bit less because they know that if they go in at full whack, then the employees aren't really going to see anything for 10 years plus. So I'm not sure if that helps to answer in a way or add some context to the question that you raised.
But clearly, the bank guarantee idea would get them back up to receiving a market rate and feeling comfortable with it.
Yeah, that's right. And we do see some selling shareholders looking for a mix of external financing from a bank. So there's some day one cash to play with. So I suppose that then reduces the deferred consideration in the form of say loan notes.
Well, this issue of valuation is more controversial now in the United States because ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, are part of our pension legislation. And so there has to be a fairness in the market price. And there's been a lot of debate, I won't bore you with, over 50 years between the Labor Department and the Association of Employee-Owned Firms. And now we're at the point where this House and Senate, with the support of the ESOP Association, is demanding that the U.S. Department of Labor lay out a very clear safe harbor to value these firms so that the risk of any lawsuits or regulation will go down very close to zero. So the rate of employee-owned firm creation can rise significantly. And this will likely become an issue here because I think independent valuation likely an issue going to develop in terms of the EOT growth in the UK.
We're fortunate that we've had a very good relationship with HM Revenue and Customs Shares and Asset Valuation Division going back to the 1970s. So we have so far avoided the conflicts that you've experienced for 50 years in the States, albeit the rules have changed now that any trustee buying must be able to prove that they have paid less than or equal to market value. So we may get a bit more focus on that coming up. We have limited time for questions, so I'm going to try and take things perhaps in a slightly different direction. Regional centres. Anybody here wanting to ask any comments, questions about regional centres?
Hi, Fiona Bell from RSM. Thanks for raising that, Graham, because that was an area that I thought was particularly interesting, that you mentioned there are regional centres in each of the US states.
27 states now.
27 states. I mean, that's very impressive. So obviously I was going to ask about funding. What is it correct that all those would be funded? So I've got two questions related to that. First of all, is that just funded by donations, or is there any state funding on that, or even federal funding, though I suspect that's unlikely? And also, do you find there's any particular regional differences between those different regional areas? Some more successful, let us say, and do you have any ideas why that might be?
In terms of differences, I'm not sure now. We have an organization called the Employee Ownership Expansion Network, which coordinates the regional centers. The funding is mainly coming from investment bankers and lawyers and local professionals who do the deals. So they're sharing some of their fees. In some states, for example, in New Jersey, we just had a major grant from the governor's office for the New Jersey Employee Ownership Center, which is based at our institute at Rutgers. We have a few state centers. The problem with state funding is when the governors change, the funding goes out. What we're starting to see now is the top 50 family foundations in the United States fund these centers. But more importantly, these 27 centers are now collaborating so they can throw up new centers quickly by sharing programs, staff, videos, and materials. And so our center is collaborating with the other centers. So we figured out a way, and it's the Employee Ownership Expansion Network that has done this, to rapidly throw up centers. Like we're throwing up several new centers in the US a year using this approach of of collaboration and private funding. And as I said, this is, I think, where we're ahead, which is the professionals have decided they have a moral responsibility to fund these centers.
Which raises another area on funding, going in a slightly different direction here. But you are asking people essentially to fund promotion of employee ownership,
Yes.
particularly private individuals.
Yes.
There's a much greater tradition of that in the States than there is here in the UK. It's almost taken for read that if you sell your company for a lot, you will give back. Whereas we don't really see that in the UK. Is there anybody going to put their hand up and comment on that from a UK perspective? There's one brave hand at the back.
Hi, I'm Jill McCoy. I'm a founder who has sold the company. I'm in Northern Ireland, and we were the first company to use the EOT trust model in Northern Ireland, and we now have 16 companies, I think, in Northern Ireland in the last 4 years. But a group of us have got together to create an organisation called Employee Ownership Ireland to promote employee ownership in the in Northern Ireland and right across Ireland. We work very closely with EOA, but it is individuals who have got together. We have actually lobbied government and got funding to support case studies for people who want to consider being employee owned. But there is a real drive, I think, because we believe in the model from people who have taken it. And what we found is that when you get people together, you can do an awful lot in a very small space of time. So we hold roadshows. We're training all the lawyers and accountants. And there's an interesting question has come up, and this is why I think local is interesting. So one of the questions that has come up in our roadshows is an idea about zombie companies, which was a real surprise to us. And the idea that has been suggested is that once a company becomes employee owned, it's not sellable again. So therefore, the advisors are creating something that once they've sold, there's no more business for them. So there's a conflict of interest there. But also the idea that if you don't have skin in the game, because you haven't put any money in 2 or 3 generations, those companies will probably not do terribly well because they're not run by people who have skin in the game. And this is a misconception that we're having to deal with at a local level in terms of employee ownership, which is one of the things that's quite good because we can talk individually to people about those. So I would certainly recommend local engagement.
I agree, misconception. Did you want to comment?
I'd like to comment on. First of all, it's great to hear that you're doing this program of training local professionals, accountants, and bankers and such. We're doing a big program like that in New Jersey, and we're hoping to see this spread around the United States. It's the same thing. Not only do grade school children and high schoolers not know about sharing the rewards, but even business brokers and accountants to small business people don't understand it. But the other point, I think that I'm just losing it for a second. I think that you raises the issue of the zombie company in the United States now. We believe that many accountants and business brokers and lawyers and bankers don't like employee ownership because they think they can't make money from it, from fees. And I think that's partially false and needs to be corrected by the state centers showing transactions and showing programs and such like that. It can be solved by the fact that we know that in the US, 55% of business owners are near retirement and only 10% of their daughters and sons are willing to buy the company, and most of them don't get offers. So that says if you could get the bankers and accountants and lawyers and local chaplains educated, that there will be more than enough deals for all of the private individuals. So that's part of the needle that has to be threaded here. But the last point that I wanted to make is that a major area for the growth of ESOPs in the United States is them merging with each other. And so we're seeing a lot of bankers and lawyers do that new merger business, and it's becoming quite a developed business. There's no reason why mergers and acquisitions shouldn't be used by the employee ownership sector in a healthy way, like it's used by the non-employee ownership sector.
Thank you. One of the big challenges you presented is how to grow employee share ownership in listed companies. I just wonder, is there anybody here who wanted to respond from that perspective. John.
John Huffmeyer from the University of Oxford. And I actually have a question and a suggestion. The suggestion relates directly to what you've just raised about the listed companies. And I believe both this question and the suggestion would be close to Robert Oakeshott's heart. Joseph, I know that you care a lot about low-income people. I think that there is a fairly accurate description that could be made about employee ownership in the United States, that up till now, we haven't done as much for really low-income people as we could have. I think that's less true in the UK. The worker cooperative is often suggested as the way to do this. And while it, I think, works incredibly well in France and Italy and Spain, the track record, and you referred to this, there hasn't been a lot of growth in these companies. I would add that there hasn't been a lot of growth in the equity values of the companies that are in this sector. So my question is, what can we do to help employee ownership, both in the countries where you and I were born, but also in this country, to help low-income workers more? And the particular suggestion that I think Robert would like relates to your 680 companies in the FTSE index, where, and maybe you wouldn't know this given that you don't live here, but a very high percentage of all the equity value in those big FTSE companies, those share values are in mining companies. I think Robert would love the idea that as we expand employee ownership, we might be helping miners in places in Africa where he used to get individuals to try to go off and travel to help employee ownership grow in those nations. I'm sorry for the long question and the long suggestion.
No, I understand the question. I'll just make a few comments. This is a real problem area. So we recently crunched some numbers in the US. And we found that workers with low salaries are not in ESOPs. ESOPs are employing workers with higher salaries. Now, the good part of this, ESOPs pay well, right? But they also don't have workers at the lowest level. 20% of our ESOPs are in manufacturing, which are well-paying, highly valuable, and employ highly trained workers. You're not going to get workers with $32,000 in salary a year working at those companies. So that's a bit of a problem. I will go out on a limb here, and I will tell you that the really low-paid workers in listed companies that do broad-based plans, that's a real area to impact lower-paid employees, especially if those plans are not based on workers purchasing the stock, but based on grants, okay? The janitors at Microsoft, I'm sure, are very happy, okay? And the problem at the ESOPs is they don't have any janitors, okay? So we need to think about this. The worker co-op sector in the United States is doing a wonderful job at dealing with the really lower paid workers. And it's not that they're necessarily creating the levels of wealth that we're seeing in ESOPs, but jobs with dignity, the working conditions and the pay is a bit better. I commend to you to go to your computer and type in upandgo.coop, upandgo.coop. It's a cleaning agency that is a worker co-op in New York City, okay, that has transformed the lives of those workers in terms of their training, their wages, their benefits, their respect, their ability to run their own company. And do they have $200,000 in wealth, employment wealth at the end of 30 years? No, but they've achieved some really significant things for the kind of demographic that John is talking about.
Do we have any employee owners here who would like to ask a question? I'm conscious I'm probably completely overrunning on time, but are we all right for another couple of questions? So,
Hi, Joseph. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. I'm Jamie. I run a company who we're looking to transition to EO, and we deliver public contracts or government contracts. have you heard of a policy, or do you think it's a good idea that government contracts, sort of the status of an organization, be it EO, they score preferentially to make sure we're getting better value out of government contracts? Is that, have you heard of that? Is that a good idea?
Yes, no, I have heard of this. It's, we have controversial issues about this in the US, because up until recent time, we have had preferential contracts for women, for veterans, and for members of certain minority groups. And the problem that we've had is that if a business owner is a veteran and he sells his company to an ESOP, okay, which is now 100% employee owned, and even if 100% of those workers are veterans, they lose their contracts, right? Because the model was based on the 100% one guy ownership. And so we're trying to thread this needle right now in the United States. And we're having a very hard time for two reasons. One is the current government leadership is just not in favor of preferential contracts at all. So it's very hard to see if that's ever going to be expanded. So the way it's being done right now is there's an effort by our New Jersey Employee Ownership Center and the National Center for Employee Ownership to develop a privately managed certification of employee-owned firms for government contracts that some governments are just recognizing, but it's not done as an official government idea. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. It reflects back to what I said before, this idea that if you have broad-based employee ownership, you pay a lower corporate tax rate. Why? Because if you have part of the polity that is spreading wealth and spreading Robert Oakeshott's vision of justice and fairness, then they should pay lower taxes because they're increasing a benefit to the polity in a significant way, different than other firms. A hard sell, but yeah, this is a rough problem for us.
Thank you.
Okay.
Joseph, I think we probably better start to wrap up. We promised tea and refreshments for everyone, I think 5 minutes ago. You promised that you would deliver on exchanging ideas between the US and the UK, and you have done that. Clearly, the UK is doing very well with its employee ownership trust model, and we're fast advancing over 2,500 new majority 100% employee-owned companies. In the States, I think the equivalent figure is perhaps 3,500. So at our current rate of growth, another 2 or 3 years, we will overtake America in terms of the number of majority employee-owned companies. But you have shown to us what the ESOP can also do in its other form, where it's delivering broad-based equity involvement to workers in listed companies. And there, the amounts are incredible. The averages are astonishing, which sets us a challenge to make sure that the EOT bonuses equal or possibly exceed, over a worker's lifetime, the rewards that can be given through an ESOP. So it's an interesting exchange of ideas. Are there any final comments you'd like to make by way of wrapping up?
I think the exchange of research and ideas and comparison is a wonderful thing, and both countries should really continue to do it because it will help both sectors continue. And we can both and should both prosper, but we have a lot to learn from each other, and we shouldn't be studying alone in our bedrooms, but working together. Thank you very much.